Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to 50 Years and Counting, reflecting on the discipline and profession of international studies. It's great to see so many of you here today, and I know there are others who are joining us online. My name is Kyle Grayson, and I am the outgoing chair of BISA. I've been a member of BISA for a chunk of its 50 years and been involved as a trustee or executive board member for nearly half of my professional career. But in many ways, it's just accidental that I happen to be here today, and it's really down to the efforts of my colleagues who are here on the panel. And I want to extend a thanks to Mark Weber for organizing the roundtable, and to Barry, Chris, Christopher, Caroline, Richard, and Ruth for being willing to participate. We really, really appreciate it. Now, before handing over to Mark, I just want to take the opportunity to state that as a professional association with a charitable mission to promote and develop international studies within the UK and beyond, BISA continues to condemn the destruction of universities and violence against academics and students in Gaza, in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, China, Colombia, Hong Kong, India, Iran, Mexico, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Pakistan, Russia, Sudan, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Turkey, Ukraine, the United States, Zimbabwe, and other jurisdictions identified by the Scholars at Risk Network. We continue to believe that every effort must be made to safeguard academic institutions and protect the lives of scholars and the communities in which they are embedded. We continue to call on the UK government to defend academic freedom by ensuring that international humanitarian and human rights law cannot be violated with impunity by any state, its agents, or organizations, and by facilitating a lasting and peaceful resolution to Palestine-Israel, such that the safety, integrity, and freedom of all academic communities in the region and others around the world are protected. Furthermore, in alignment with our charitable mission, BISA continues to be committed to providing a plural, welcoming, and inclusive space for colleagues and practitioners to engage in vibrant, critical, and respectful scholarly exchange. So I can say this because I'm on my way out, and it's very easy to commit those who are going to follow me to all sorts of things. But I am confident that the incoming BISA executive and board of trustees will remain dedicated to defending the discipline and academic freedom, as well as listening to and working alongside our members and colleagues to advance this agenda, and doing so within the Charities Act, under which we have particular legal obligations. So thank you all very, very much. I'm now going to turn things over to Mark.
Thank you, Kyle. So my first challenge is to make sure the tech works. That's the thing I'm most worried about at this point, not necessarily engaging with the various distinguished people on the panel. So you can hear me at the back? You can hear me at the front? Excellent. Okay. And actually, this is an indication I don't need to shout, because actually I'm speaking pretty quietly and there's quite a reverb. Okay, well, my name is Mark Weber, Professor of International Politics, University of Birmingham, and a former BISA chair. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment. What I want to do first is just set out a little bit of context for this event. 50 years of the British International Studies Association. We will probably hear from some of our panelists in the course of the evening, something about the history of the organization, and of course its early days, very formative and at one time lost to institutional memory. But if you go to the BISA website, you'll see a lot of that has been resurrected in information on previous chairs and previous conferences and so on. The first BISA conference was held in 1975. This was the year, of course, BISA was formed. And at that point, a mere 104 delegates turned up, including 9 from the Foreign Office, so just under 10% were from the Foreign Office. And a pub quiz question I asked Richard earlier, who actually got the answer correct is which university, or if you will, higher education institute, had the highest representation at the inaugural conference. It was North Staff's Polytechnic, which may be a surprise to some of you, but not all of you. Some of you, of course, were taught there and may, in fact, have been employed there. But actually, that's worth remembering. BISA has not been an organization dedicated only, if you like, to so-called top-flight universities. It has had an important connection to what we would now refer to as the post-92s, which prioritize teaching as well as research. Its formation in 1975 was quite late in the day. The Political Studies Association was formed in 1950, so that's 25 years earlier. UACES, the University Association for Contemporary European Studies, of which we have at least one former chair on the panel, was formed in 1967. And both those organizations had journals, Political Studies and the Journal of Common Market Studies. And BISA, in some ways, followed that precedent. Upon its establishment, the British Journal of International Studies was created, and I had cause to go and look at that yesterday, and including an article by one David Whitman, the first chair of department in my own University of Politics and International Studies, which is worth a read. It's 10 pages of the trauma of trying to set up an international studies program in a university. And he makes the point in that article that at that time, believe it or not, there were only 8 awarding international relations degrees in the country. And fewer, I think it's 5 departments where international relations, international studies was in the name tag. So in that sense, it was a marginal subject, and it was overshadowed, if that's the right word, by political studies, area studies. And that relationship, if you will, I guess we're going to hear a little bit about today. But it is important that we remember that conjoining, because BISA has been one format in where, if you will, international studies has not been subsumed by political science. So those of us currently or formerly involved in university senior management will be familiar with HISA data and the REF and so on, where politics and international studies are treated as one and the same thing. In fact, to this day, it would be very difficult. I tried yesterday to find out distinct information on IR or international studies degrees only. It's impossible because the data is conjoined with political science. So one of the great benefits of BISA is that international studies, international relations as a separate discipline from political science has always been respected. So 1975, so just think about that. The younger people in the room clearly didn't live through that meeting, but this was a time before the Research Excellence Framework, before the National Student Survey, before university subject league tables, and believe it or not, before the internet. So this was a time when the conduct of scholarship, not least in international relations, which of course, being international, nowadays we take the internet and other forms of social communication for granted. That was not the case in 1975. Now this is an organization where rather than 104 coming to a conference, I don't know the exact figure, but I think last year it was 1,000, 2 journals alongside Review of International Studies, the European Journal of International Security, a Cambridge University Press book series, a postgraduate network, 31 working groups, 11 prizes, and 2 annual student simulations. So the organization has come a long way. If I had time, I would also go on a riff about how the world has changed in that 50 years, but there are far more eminent people than me to do that. But back in 75, just think of this. This was before Hedley Bull's Anarchical Society, Waltz's Theory of International Politics, Susan Strange's States and Markets, Nicholas Onoff's World of Our Making, and so on. So some of the canonical texts of IR, which we teach and study and have been influential, those did not exist in 1975, the era of the Cold War, global communism, and so on. Now, to make sense of some of this, we have up on stage a number of former chairs. I'll introduce them very briefly, and it'll be just one line of biography. They were given a brief, very loosely from me yesterday, on the issues to consider, but they are at liberty to reflect on any of their personal, professional experiences of BISA and the profession over the last 50 years. So to help in this task, and we will go in this order, we have first of all Barry Buzan, who was BISA chair, I think the details up there, 1988 to 1990, currently Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Chris Brown, next to Barry, Emeritus Professor of International Relations, also at the LSE, BISA chair 97 to 98. Chris Hill, Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Cambridge, BISA chair 1990 to 2000. Caroline Kennedy Pipe, Professor of War Studies at my former university, Loughborough University, BISA chair 2005-2006. Richard Whitman, BISA chair 2017 to 2018, Professor of Politics and International Relations, University of Kent. And then immediately to my right, Ruth Blakeley, BISA chair 2020 to 2022, Professor of Politics and IR, and Head of Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Sheffield. So each will speak for, I guess, maximum of 5 minutes, and we'll go in turn without interruption, repetition, etc. And at that point, I may ask a few questions, depending on the heat in the room. And I will then hand over to the audience, both in the room and indeed online. We have people joining us on Zoom as well as in the room. And we will hopefully have quite an interactive discussion. It is worth bearing in mind, finally, that as well as being BISA chairs and distinguished academics, most, if not everybody up here has been a head of department, a head of school, an editor of a journal or a book series, member of a ref panel, etc. So a lot of experience of international studies, both intellectually and in terms of managing, mentoring, and organizing our discipline. So that's enough for me to start with. So without further ado, if I hand over to Barry first. Thank you.
Can I speak from here or from there?
Wherever you're most comfortable. Can if you wish, you could, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. I want to tell you a little story about BISA from the days when I was chair, way back when, as you can see. In those days, as Mark has indicated, BISA was a much smaller, more intimate kind of organization, relatively informal, quite new. I guess I was the first second-generation leader after David Whitman and Susan and all of that. I wasn't even a professor when I became the chair of BISA. But I want to tell you a story that happened at that time, which I think very few of you will know, but which has quite big consequences for the international relations world in which we still live. This was, of course, when the Cold War was ending, and globalization was getting underway, although we didn't know that at the time. But the first thing that happened to me when the first thing that arrived on my desk, as it were, was a request from the Secretary General of the ISA for my annual report. And this, I have to say, took me aback quite considerably, because I had no idea that we were part of a federation in which we were supposed to provide an annual report to the ISA. So I wrote around the former chairs and such and said, what's this? And how am I supposed to respond to this? Because I don't like the feel of it. It brought out a sovereign streak in me, I have to say, which the rest of the then executive committee shared. And when we put it to the membership at the time, they also shared that we kind of all thought that ISA, or the American International Studies, was very dominant already. And the last thing we needed was to have ISA, the organization, gearing itself up to be the kind of global federative body for the whole thing. We had no problem at all with the idea that there should be some kind of global federative body, because there were other, as it were, national ISAs. But the ISA had been involved, it got early into the game of globalization, and it was involved particularly in bringing in Europeans into the governing bodies of ISA, and paying for them to go to the meetings and all of that. A very effective strategy, and a strategy made effective by the fact that there was no European ISA. So there was a kind of vacuum there, which the Americans were keen to fill. Long story short, we, BISA, decided to oppose this and try to put something in place in Europe. Because we didn't like the idea of the American organization becoming the dominant one. I mean, they are the dominant one, but informally, please, not formally so. John Groom was and the story is, in a sense, mainly a story about him. And I think he deserves more recognition in BISA history than he gets. He was vice chair, I was chair, although you wouldn't know it from then. I was actually chair for 3 years, the last person to do that, I think, because in these days the BISA annual meeting was held just before Christmas, a very controversial thing, which a lot of people loved and a lot of people hated. We gathered in freezing cold universities where the heat had been turned off for several days beforehand, but it had a certain kind of intimacy to it. Anyway, John and I and the rest of the executive committee thought two things needed to be done. One, we needed to tackle ISA, and the other, we needed to try and get something in place in Europe. There had been other attempts to get a European ISA of some sort together, all of which had sunk on the rocks of French insistence that the whole thing be held bilingually, which was just impossibly expensive to do, so it never happened. The division of labor was that I would take on ISA, while John, who had both the language and the diplomatic skills that I certainly did not, tried to do something in Europe. My job turned out to be incredibly easy. I wrote one letter and addressed it to the executive committee of the ISA. And unbeknownst to me, there were a lot of people inside ISA who were rather annoyed with this globalizing project because it was spending ISA money on foreigners, right? A portent of the future there. But they hadn't been able to stand up against it because who could possibly oppose the globalization of international relations? But as soon as somebody objected, I had an army, right? And they did the rest of the job. So I just had to write one letter. John, however, had the job of trying to put something in place in Europe. And he did that with extraordinary dedication and diligence and skill, pretty much all through the 1990s, both when he was chair and subsequently. So the fact that we have a European International Studies Association and the fact that there's a European Journal of International Relations, none of that would have happened unless if John hadn't done all of that hard work of putting that stuff into place. So the landscape of international relations in which we still exist has quite strong markers from that time. It's not that the ISA isn't still the biggest and richest and best organized outfit in the business, but it isn't the global center of the business. And for that, we have largely to thank John Groom, and I think he should get a more prominent place in our history. Thank you.
that's working.
Hi. We took a quick consultation and decided that we were going to sit down, right? So I'm sorry about the little wedge of people who can't see us properly, but I think the sound system is better from this. It's always a problem when you're six people, and you're all given the same question, that you're all going to say give the same answers. And the way to avoid that, of course, is to say something stupid. And to give you an illustration, there was a great conference in Aberystwyth in 1994, the Positivism and Beyond conference. And there was a general panel and a question from the audience, which I think was asked by Cynthia Enlow. And she said, when was the last time you were surprised? When was the last time you were surprised by things in the world? And, you know, the people on the panel, they said, well, the end of the Cold War, that was kind of surprising, the way it worked out the way it did. This was 94, and so people said the end of apartheid in South Africa was quite important, and that surprised them. And then it got to Emanuel Wallerstein, who announced that nothing had surprised him in the previous 50 years, and that everything had worked out exactly as the plan suggested. So that's the sort of thing not to say if you're in a group answering these questions. One of the questions was things that have happened in the real world, in quotation marks, but I'm not sure. I think it's probably better to talk really about BISA and the world rather than the real world as such. It strikes me that Barry's just been talking about the institutional side of relations with the ISA, but I think BISA has also been very important in the intellectual relationship, because let's face it, the Anglo-Saxon, the English language profession is in one level, it's a unified profession. At another level, of course, there are differences between national ISAs. But one of the big differences, I think, that was important in the 1980s and 90s in particular, was that the American profession, I'm thinking now of IR theory, because of course that's what was my bag, as it were, the American profession became quite restricted in the mainstream. The neo-neo relationship, as Oliveva described it at the time in an excellent article, the idea that really we should be focusing on anarchy and on whether cooperation was possible or not possible and what were the terms under anarchy and so on. I think it became rather restricted, whereas there were a lot of people who didn't want that restriction, and they found, and many of them from the States came to British conferences partly because of they felt that they will get a better audience for people who were not following that that shift that took place in mainstream American academy. So you've got people like James Tadarian coming to study under Hedley Bull, you know, and Hedley apparently asked him on the first interview, why do you want to come to Britain? And he said, well, I don't know what my independent variable is, and I think you guys don't care. And this was, of course, broadly true. And so there was I think the British profession was important in opening it up. Partly that was because the British profession was quite traditional. I mean, this is a period when the English school is being defined, and in a way they're a continuation of the past. They're not some. What's distinctive about IR theory in the 80s and 90s wasn't the English school, because the English school was saying the sort of things that had been said 20, 30 years before. What was distinctive was the new focus on anarchy in the States. So the English school provided a kind of background, but also I think people were very tolerant and open to post-structuralist, modern, even, gender issues, philosophical issues, a whole range of things which became problematic in the American profession were supported in Britain. So I think that was very important. And I think that's been one major contribution that BISA has made to international studies over the last 50 years, is to be a home for non-orthodox thinking about these subjects. Now, I said the 80s and 90s. I've been less in contact with what's going on in the 20s, in the 21st century. And to some extent, it looks to me that a lot of good questions are being asked, but they're being asked in too limited a way. I think the emphasis nowadays on things like race and empire and colonialism are important, but they need to be put into the widest possible context. I mean, empire isn't something that was invented in the 17th century by Europeans. Empire is much wider than that, and neither is race politics and slavery. So I think to some extent there has been a problem over this. In terms of the conditions, one of the questions we were asked, and I'll stop some, one of the questions we were asked was the conditions for academic study and scholarship. I would make 2 points here. One is, I think things have got much worse for early career researchers and the young. I mean, I've been reasonably prolific as a publisher, but I published 2 small things in the first 10 years of my career, which I got away with then. I wouldn't get promoted without publishing, but my job wasn't at stake. Nowadays, we're asking PhD students to finish their doctorate in 4 years, to publish it immediately, to do 2 articles around it, and so on and so forth. We're not giving people a chance. I mean, I spent that 10 years building up international intellectual capital, which I used for the rest of my career. These folks don't have the chance to build up capital in that way. And I think that's very regrettable in terms of the modern profession. The second point I would make is really that I worry that we've become slightly an echo chamber. Intellectual diversity doesn't exist in the sense that it used to. If I think back, I started life as a student at the LSE in the 1960s, and the greatest influence on me there was Michael Oakeshott. Without doubt, the political theory lectures that he gave. I studied international relations, and Philip Windsor was very important as an influence as well, but Michael was much more important. The truth of the matter is Oakeshott wouldn't get a job at the LSE nowadays. He wouldn't get shortlisted. We have become a univocal profession in which any ideas that are to the right of centre or even the centre are getting suppressed nowadays. And I would worry very much about that. And the combination of that with the problems for early career researchers makes me somewhat depressed about the future of the profession in this country. But I don't want to depress people more than they already are, so I'll pass on to Chris.
Thank you very much. I will stand up for a minute so that you here have the glory of seeing me. Perhaps I'll continue standing even because this pulpit is in the way of some of you. We're supposed to react in a way what our predecessors have said on this panel, I think, and I'm not going to do too much of that. But I'll pick up the point about no surprises, because Wallerstein you wouldn't think of as it's usually the realists who are not surprised by anything, isn't it? They've seen it all before. It all goes back to Thucydides and so on. Wallerstein doesn't fall into that category. The one thing, I was thinking about what I've been surprised by, and Chris mentioned a few of them. I mean, none of us have got foresight in these matters, so quite a lot of things surprise us. The one thing that really has surprised me is the delayed reaction to decolonization, if you like, because decolonization, for the most part, took part, certainly in Africa, between 1957 and 1964. It's only in the last 10, 15 years that the intellectual reaction, it's almost as if it takes 2 or 3 generations to say, just a minute, what were these guys doing? You know, why didn't we actually say something rather harsh about it before? And it's because it takes time. Intellectual, cultural, political ideas take time to gestate, and people have to simply cope with practical consequences. So in some ways, we intellectuals are behind the game rather than ahead of it, as we like to think. I'm a bit different from these guys because I see these two as, in a way, professional IR people, that they were trained properly in international relations, although they probably, both of them would qualify that remark. But I'm really coterminous with BISA, my career, and I was trained in history and political science at Oxford. And they didn't do IR at Oxford. It's like Chris said, I wouldn't get a job now in the circumstances that I was in 1973 when I came to the LSE as equivalent of a kind of research fellow before I'd finished my DPhil and discovering what international relations was. So I was educating myself as well as educating the students, which was a bit of a cheat, but a lot of people did it. And of course, a lot of people, even after me, had not had a formal training in IR. You know, Fred Halliday had done PPE at Oxford. Susan Strange had she done IR at, well, yeah, I suppose she had actually, but she'd done so many other things as well before she actually turned up as professor at LSE. So the thing I want to say, and I'm actually going to sit down for a minute because being old, you get a little bit tired on these things. The story I want to tell you is about the international studies bit of it, picking up what Mark said, because having had history and political science in my formation, but having discovered this important subject called international relations, I also found myself bridging it a bit, not just because of what I'd done in the past, but because I was interested in decision-making and foreign policy decision-making in particular. And I remember, I think it was at the first conference, actually, when Headley turned up. And a man called Adid Dawisha, who some of you will know, who wrote a book on Egypt's foreign policy, was a PhD student at the LSE at the time. And we called him Eddie at the time. That sign of the times had changed. And he asked Headley a perfectly reasonable question about how far decision-making was important in trying to understand the international political system. And I quote Headley, and this is an accurate quote, but you'll have to forgive the language. Headley said, "Oh, all this decision-making stuff is not worth pissing on, is it really?" And that was an example of the kind of d'Autemps approach of the great and the good towards PhD students at the time. And BISA has done a lot to overcome that. Now, I don't say that just to take a cheap shot at Headley, who's dead and can't answer back and would have certainly answered back had he been here. But he wasn't totally typical. You know, I loved my own professor, Geoffrey Goodwin, who was very good to me at LSE. But there's no doubt that he could sometimes be a pretty fierce colonel and put you down. But the good thing about Geoffrey was that you had a good row and then it was finished, all over, and he would treat you as an equal. But the other thing I really want to say, apart from the kind of point about hierarchy, which I think BISA has done a lot to overcome and encouraged early career researchers and a general sense of a horizontal relationship between all of us involved in the profession, is that one of the big differences I have noticed is the way in which historians and international relations people had a divide between them when I first joined. The historians tended to think that we were, you guys are doing the first draft of history until we get around to it properly. Really, you're doing current affairs. It wasn't helped by the fact that quite a lot of people at LSE were going across to Bush House to give 2 minutes worth of current affairs on the BBC World Service. But so were some of the historians, actually, by the way. But over the years, I think that although at the beginning in BISA, there was a very strong international history working group, for all I know, there probably still is, and that's very important. But there was genuine, at least, parallelism. You could go to the panels, and gradually the historians would learn that the people doing IR weren't quite so naive or stupid as they might have thought. And actually, they might have known some things, and actually it might even, under the 30 years rule, have consulted a few of the archives. So gradually, there's been a convergence over the years. And the other thing, which is not unrelated, is that because I'm a Europeanist, obviously I've got, over the years, got more and more connections with different continental traditions of thinking about not just international relations, but history as well. And of course, within Europe, there's the Copenhagen school, there are different traditions. And I've had, I suppose, more to do with France and Italy. But especially in Southern Europe, but also perhaps in Germany, international politics was studied through the means of basically law, history, and philosophy. And that was, of course, very useful contributions in their own way. But they didn't have that kind of intellectual scaffolding, which international relations as a profession, I won't call it a discipline, but as a subject area, actually has provided. And over my career, the development of IR in almost all the continental countries, and indeed including now the countries of old Central and Eastern Europe, has been quite a marked development. And it's paralleled with the tremendous growth in international relations which BISA has witnessed. We are here as old so-and-sos, and therefore saying it was always better in the old days. So I don't want to be too critical, but one of the things, I've got 1 minute left, I would say, is that I think, if anything, I think we've overproduced the number of PhDs because it's difficult to, although in some ways it was easier. There weren't all that many jobs then, and actually now, proportionate to the number of PhDs being produced, there are still not many jobs. It's still quite difficult to get one. And certainly in my area of European studies, I can see lots of PhDs chasing too few subjects in a way. So to some extent, I think we do need to accept a little degree of parsimony in all this. And the other critical comment I would make, and it echoes a bit what Chris Brown said, I think it's not so much of univocal, although I think that the Americanization of the subject, not just through the dominance of Waltz and all that for a period, and then American versions of constructivism, but also the journals, the power of the journals and the RAF and all the rest of it. But the other thing is that we're all responsible for, is that we live in our own silos. To some extent, the consequence of professionalization is that we become more specialized. We tend to, maybe BISA now doesn't do this and is a way of counteracting it. But I think it's a warning shot to say that it's all too easy just to meet the people who are already interested in what we're interested in, they're specialists in what we're specialists in, and maybe even they actually take the same kind of normative positions that we might take. And there's a lot to be said, going back to Hedley Bull, for a degree of iconoclasm and encouragement of independent thought and demanding that we confront our own assumptions. And long may BISA encourage that.
So firstly, can you hear me? Yeah. No. Just come on. Brilliant. So firstly, thank you for the invitation to be here. What I have to disagree with respectfully, those who came before me, I just found BISA great fun, and running BISA extraordinary fun, because we were in an era after 9/11 where international politics appeared darker than it had been for many, many years, in which the country seemed to be under attack from terrorists again. And so what BISA, I think, allowed us to do was to push forward with the help of people in critical security studies, but the actual study of terrorism in all of its various guises. So I started by saying fun. And it was fun because we had the opportunity, I think, to forge a new understanding of some of the troubled currents of international relations, and do that through an interdisciplinary focus. And one of the things I think the Review of International Studies did brilliantly in that period was to open up its pages, its admissions process, to a whole raft of articles that got us to think about the world in a different way, to infuse our understandings of international relations with theological understandings, more critical understandings of terrorism, and to really get us to unpack notions of state power even as suicide bombers attacked London, for example. We also debated intensely. I remember very clearly Paul Rogers chairing an extremely spirited debate between Laurie Friedman and himself on causes and consequences of Iraq. Huge questions about deployment of military force. And that in turn, I think, led to a resurgence of security studies and war studies, grounded also in a wider appreciation, I think, of other societies and the so-called developing world, and a world in which people were dispossessed. So in that period in BISA, I think post 9/11, we really did help, I think, shape, along with Paul Rogers, what it might take to understand those in the world who felt dispossessed, who didn't have access to resources, and who would resort to political violence. And because of that, we did actually, in a first, take the BISA conference to University College Cork. Never gone outside, never gone to the Republic before. And that in itself was controversial, because we invited Garrett Fitzgerald, the architect of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, to come and talk to us about how those type of peace negotiations could take place. There was something else which I think was also important. When I took over BISA with Paul, we were running it basically from Pauline Kelly's house in Staffordshire. Pauline Kelly was unpaid, no pension, and was running BISA as a labour of love. And Neil Cooper and I, who was the treasurer, we used to meet in lay-bys in Yorkshire and sign cheques. And nobody even took any notice of what we were spending. So at that point, rather than get arrested, we thought we should get a solicitor and an accountant involved, which Pauline resisted, because this was her organisation, and she devoted her life to it. But we appointed accountants and lawyers and started, I think, what you see now, which is a hugely professional and accountable charity. But all that became necessary when we tried to formalise the status of BISA, to put it on its footing that it should have been. And it was an interesting period, because perhaps because of 9/11, perhaps because of Iraq and Afghanistan, more students wanted to study international relations and politics than they did political science. And you can imagine that made us very popular with some people in the PSA, because we had an enormous presence in universities, and we had a demand for the expertise, a thirst for knowledge. Now, we reconciled that. But even now, when you look at figures for undergraduate admissions, and indeed postgraduate and PhDs, and I welcome all the PhD students, because you don't actually have to become an academic. Many of our PGRs go on to enormously important occupations. And so this was a period which was really, I think, formative for BISA, going from, as I said, off Pauline's kitchen table to something, I think, far more organisationally structured and impressive. But the thing I want to say about the conference is we did go to Cork. We're here in Belfast, which I think is hugely important. The conference brings people together, and at no time, I think, has that been more important than post-COVID, when we were talking to each other at a distance, not conversing perhaps in the way that we do now. And so the conference, and Juliet, you and the team have done a fantastic job at bringing us all together. I think that this is where the conversations really start for many of our younger folk. And it's where I think those of us at the end of our careers can really reflect, I think, on the safe hands that the next generation will bring to BISA. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I am sort of closer to my pension than I was when I was BISA chair, and I'm going to avoid too much nostalgia, partly because I'm a BISA boomer. or an international relations boomer. I mean, I've benefited from all of the fantastic things that were put in place by my predecessors. I've lapped up the fact that we've had a sort of healthy student numbers, which have sort of kept me in employment, as well as made my teaching life interesting. I've benefited from people who are in the room here in having the chance to teach alongside them or to examine alongside them. And even more, I've benefited from people in the room here because we had the infrastructure to actually talk about the things we wanted to talk about in a conference and in working group formats, which, to me are the sort of bedrock of the specialness, I think, of BISA, or what's ended up being the specialness of BISA. And all of that was possible not just because of the chairs, of course, but crucially because of the trustees. And one of the interesting things about being a chair and being a trustee in BISA is you meet people from other institutions and see them in a very different light from the way that you might see them in the sort of intellectual cut and thrust, because you're brought together with people who have put themselves forward to provide a sort of service to the discipline at some cost, some time, but also they're motivated by, I think, probably in the first instance, quite altruistic reasons for doing so. They soon get disabused of that, of course, when they face the reality of what you have to do for the charity commissioners, or how we have to make sure the accounts are set, and the constant worry about income for the association and keeping the show on the road. But it is, I think, a sort of strength of the association that it runs as a consequence of that dynamism and energy of the trustees, who draw on the life force that is the members, and under the enthusiastic guidance of what we now have in terms of an executive director. And if you think that in BISA's history it has had very few individuals who have taken on that role, which is either suggests that they're completely insane, each person who's done it, or that they've actually found the interaction with academics who work in international relations a worthwhile undertaking. And I'd like to think that it was actually the latter. So, we've been fantastically served by Pauline, by Gail, by Juliet, but I think we've also, ended up in many ways with the ideal type relationship between, the office, as some might have called it in the past, or the secretariat, or the engine room of the association. So I think, I want to thank everybody who's here for supporting the association, thank them for the trustees that have put their names forward, and those who have been in those leadership roles in the past. But, I joked about being a boomer, but unfortunately the downside of being an international relations boomer is we also had to put up with the neoliberal university. And, that has borne quite heavily, I think, on the experience of teaching and researching international relations over the last couple of decades, as has the political economy of higher education, which we are now in a stressed condition. And these are obviously conditions under which professional associations are even more important, I think, in terms of providing a respite from some of the difficult experiences that people are getting in their day job. I just want to say one more thing about sort of where I came from, in the sense that I'm a sort of interloper, because really I'm an area studies person. And one of the interesting things about BISA when I turned up as a PhD student, and I was elected as chair, uncontested, I love those elections, was the fact that really I was trained under Steve Smith, which means, you can make of that what you will, in terms of my understanding of international relations. And that was, I had the inter-paradigm debate bludgeoned into my head. We only got 1 week on post-positivism. But we did get Hollis and Smith in conversation as they were writing that book, which was, at the time, I don't think we appreciated it. It was a very interesting and engaging way to get us interested in some things that we might otherwise thought about. Anyway, my background is area studies, and area studies is a very cautionary tale. because area studies and European studies, which is the bit of area studies that I'm from, which was a disciplinary and interdisciplinary meeting place, has in effect disappeared from universities in the sense in which it operated. It was both an organising principle for many new universities in the 1960s that didn't have departments. They actually had boards of examiners and tended to teach across disciplines. But European studies was in effect killed in the UK by two things. One, the decline of language teaching, and that is a core skill, which we all, I think, appreciate is absolutely crucial for understanding other cultures. But at the same time, it's killed by the REF, the RE, because it disappeared as a subject. And that gave universities the opportunity to sort of fold it into politics and international studies. And or some people went off to business, others went off to economics, and so on and so on. I obviously lament that it's disappeared, but I think one of the things that has sort of kept me going is the fact that as that happened, BISA became more interdisciplinary, came much more questioning about some of its roots in terms of the epistemology of the discipline, has been much more willing to draw from anthropology, from psychology. History's always been there. We don't have enough lawyers floating around, I think. But, it has been a place where it's been possible to explore and to challenge and to take on new perspectives. And I hope that will long continue to be the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak to a BISA crowd, and I'm sure you're not going to disappoint. I actually want to start with a hike that Mark and I decided we would do. I think we agreed we would do this in January 2021. And there was news of this disease around the world happening, which we knew very little about. But we thought, we'll take the risk, we'll be outside, it will be fine. So Mark trotted up to Derbyshire, I'm in Sheffield, we both love the Peak District. And we went on what, if you've been to the Peak District in January, February, you'll understand what I'm talking about. About 25 kilometres of very hard slog in sideways rain. The purpose of this hike was, it was part of a handover from Mark to me. And I want to mention this because actually Mark won't tell you this himself, but he did something really ambitious when he was chair of BISA. It's very boring, but it was really, really important. He spent more money than BISA has ever spent on a single thing before to sort out BISA's website and back office platforms and customer relations system. Boring, bureaucratic, absolutely critical. And then a week after we went hiking, we were all in lockdown. I cannot tell you how significant that decision was for Mark to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to bring BISA into the 21st century with its tech. Because very quickly in COVID, we were able to shift online and deliver a service to our members that frankly saved the organisation from bankruptcy. You will all know, because you've done this very recently, that when you register for the conference, you're reminded that you're a BISA member and you really do need to pay up. In 2021, when the conference was cancelled, membership plummeted by 2/3. So did much of BISA's income stream. And Juliet and I genuinely thought that BISA was on the cusp of bankruptcy. We explored all sorts of unpalatable options to save ourselves, including a merger with PSA. That was, in fact, the least palatable option. And actually, what we did was work out that very quickly we needed to offer something to BISA members that they weren't going to get from anything else. The website made that possible. An amazing comms lead who still works for BISA, Chrissy Duxon, also made that possible. And so actually through the whole of both of the lockdowns, we were offering 2-3 events a week for BISA members, bringing the community together on platforms that were really sophisticated compared to what most people were offering. And then it meant when we were able to offer an online conference the year after, actually people came back because they had the confidence that we had the technical capabilities to do this well and do it in a way that would sustain our community. So I do want to note the major achievements of Mark in that. It was really insightful to do that work despite the price tag, which we all gulped at the time. But I actually also want to thank you as members. You've been loyal. There are people here who've been coming to BISA for decades. And without you responding to our begging letters to please pay your membership despite us not offering you an in-person conference, you stayed loyal. And actually, BISA's membership is now the highest it's ever been. And that, I think, is testament to people who've gone before me. So I was COVID chair. I suppose you could say I played a role in saving the association from bankruptcy, which I am quite proud of. I would also say that now that I'm trying to run a faculty in similarly difficult financial challenges, it was good preparation. But I want to spend my last couple of minutes perhaps riffing off a couple of things that others have said and talk about the sort of future of the discipline as I see it. So I take seriously the concerns that people have raised about whether we are siloed as a discipline, whether we have a bit of a monoculture or a kind of uniform way of thinking about certain issues. And I would say that while I, to a degree, share some of those concerns, I also think that the concerns that BISA members are exercised by continue to be hugely pressing and important. And indulge me, if you will, in reflecting on my time as an academic rather than just as BISA chair. I handed in my master's dissertation the week that 9/11 happened. And I think that many of us in BISA recognise that that was truly world-changing, not simply in terms of the scale of threat to the Western or global North world, but actually also to the fears that we would have about what it would do to a global order such that it existed, liberal democracy such that it is with all its flaws, and also to international institutions. I will confess that when I was doing IR theory as a master's student, the week on institutions didn't thrill me to bits. I now think that actually our international institutions are on life support. We see this most acutely with UNRWA, but we see it in many, many other international institutions that are there to uphold democratic values, principles of liberty, freedom, women's and girls' rights. All of these are at massive risk. And as a profession, I think we've been very, very good, and rightly so, in critiquing our international institutions, challenging them when they are hypocritical, when they're weak, when they fail, when they indulge corporate and state interests. But frankly, they are what sits between freedom and life for many millions in the world and survival. And I think as a profession, we probably have a responsibility to return to our reflections on international institutions, both in a conceptual sense and then in a real world sense. Think about what are the research projects that we can do? What are the skills that we can bring? What is the analysis, the data analysis that we can do to show the importance and significance of these institutions when, frankly, things that we hold dear are very much at risk? And I'm hopeful about that. I think it's helpful that although we all hate the way in which the profession has changed and the way that funding is massively skewed towards engineering and sciences and away from social sciences, there are opportunities and we need to seize them. Funders are interested in big, ambitious projects that are interdisciplinary and ask these questions about how we sustain a planet in the face of climate change, how we meet the needs of billions of people threatened by climate change, how we address those questions of fundamental rights to education, water, food. And I think we should be using our skills as credible social scientists with those skills around data analysis, really rigorous interrogation of information, to look for those opportunities to work with our colleagues across a range of disciplines and build those ambitious projects that will answer some of those pressing questions. People are doing it. Look at a project like the Correlates of War, amazing work on the impacts of war for climate change. BISA members are involved in that, big US-funded project through foundations. That's the kind of ambition I think we need to have to take BISA on through the next few years of what are going to be very turbulent times in the 21st century. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, panelists. I do remember that walk very well, and there was an emerging theme coming from the speakers about the encroaching professionalization and competence of the organization. Not that its original incarnation was the opposite of that, but even in its latter years, the chair, with the support of the trustees, could still sign off on a plus £100,000 project. And, from writing checks in lay-bys to setting up a website. But then in a way, it's the beauty of the organization. Many of us who've worked in management and universities, are very familiar with layer upon layer of approval and bureaucracy. And one of the great things about BISA, although it has ordinances and a membership and, the trustees are accountable, the slickness, the ability to move when necessary, in its organization and intellectually, which was another theme that came out, I think, is what sets it apart, if you will, from a university and a university department. My initial estimate that these introductions would take 30 minutes has been blown out of the water, so I'm not going to do a Michael Parkinson now or a Terry Wogan and engage fulsomely with the panelists. What I'll do instead is collect some comments from the floor. And all I would ask at this point is, if you have a question, try and make it of general relevance to us all, rather than one particular individual. So a majority, at least, of us have an opportunity to respond. So we have got roughly half an hour, so that's time enough, I think, to have a few interventions. So I see one already. So normal rules apply. If you could identify yourself, ask your question. So I'll collect 2 or 3. I see another one at the back. So if we go 1, 2, and do I see a third? 3. Okay, in that order. 1, 2, 3, and then we'll see how the audience wish to respond.
Yes, thank you. Matthias Albert from the University of Bielefeld. I have a hypothesis, but I don't have a data set to test it, only a personal impression, and I wonder whether you share this impression. The impression is that BISA started very British in terms of its participation, membership, conference attendance, became more international, but has somewhat returned to being more British again. When I started attending BISA conferences, BISA was the place to be for a young IR scholar. It was the place to be. And I think there was a noticeably larger audience participation from abroad. Quite a few people from Germany, as myself, more Americans, Scandinavians, a reliable crowd of Finns, for whatever reason, who always were present. And I think this was because of the intellectual vibrancy, and that international participation seems to have diminished. Now, mind you, I think the first BISA conference I went to was in 1992 at Swansea. That was after the first Pan-European conference was held. So it's not only that has diminished international participation. Of course, granted, the European conference moving from triennial to biennial to annual might have contributed. But I also think the lack of heating notwithstanding, the uneven quality of politicians' contributions who were invited as plenary speakers notwithstanding, the unfortunately very even performance of the cooks for the conference dinner notwithstanding, BISA did have a unique asset and a unique spot in an Everdancer conference calendar with the pre-Christmas thing. And I think that accounts for part of the de-internationalization. Do you share that impression? Should the conference be moved back to pre-Christmas? Now, mind you, the reason then giving for moving it away from pre-Christmas is that it was getting more and more difficult to secure student accommodation for conference delegates. As far as I can see, that has disappeared even in June. So do you agree with the diagnosis of the internationalization and de-internationalization and my plea to move it back to Christmas?
A controversial one to start. Okay, yes, please, at the back. I also went to that conference, by the way. I do not have happy memories of it.
Hello, I'm Laura MacLeod. I'm at the University of Manchester and I'm also a current BISA trustee. So first things first, thank you very much for all your stories and memories tonight. I've loved hearing them all, so thank you for that. Well, I have two questions. I shall keep them really brief. My first question is that I'm really fascinated at how many of you have got a background that you claim is not in international relations. So here's my query. Do we need formal training in international relations to be in international relations? That's my first question. My second question is, I currently sit on the trustees at the EDI director, and I meet with EDI reps from other professional associations. And one of the constant questions we're talking about is what does the body of our profession look like? So I was wondering if you could reflect on what I hope is a story of a growing diversity of bodies in this discipline, and also how we can get better at it. How we can be more inclusive and more diverse in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Behind. Yep.
Hi, John Williams, Durham University. You mentioned that nearly 10% of the attendees at the first BISA conference in 1975 were from the Foreign Office. I've been coming to BISA, I think, since Swansea 92. I think we must have attended our first BISA, the same one. I too have very few happy memories of it. Jim Callaghan's after-dinner speech, I recall, was interesting. And I think a story of one of the members of the BISA exec having drunk the bottle of whiskey due to be given to Jim Callaghan during the course of the dinner was also memorable from that one. There have been FCO people at conferences since then that I've been to, but not in a very long time. And in an era when we have, people being sick of experts, we've had enough of experts, a radical approach to anti-intellectualism amongst populist approaches to international politics. What's the association's role, do you think, or should the association have a role in trying to counter those kinds of political currents, and how might we go about doing that to the best effect?
Thank you. And also, we have one question online, which is very succinct, but no doubt will require some elaboration in answering. Is the West liberal? That's from Paul Rogers, who is online. So what I suggest is we proceed as follows. We'll go in reverse order. So that starts with Ruth over to Barry, and you can comment on any of the interventions you've heard. All I would ask is if you can be as brief as possible, which would allow us another round. So Ruth first.
Paul probably knows my answer to his question. No, I think it has played a liberal role, but I think the West has proven itself time and again that it doesn't live up to its own liberal credentials, and here we are. I will take the BISA conference at Christmas and roll it into my answer to questions around EDI, actually. So there are numerous reasons why decisions were taken. I believe I was a trustee, so I am implicated in the decision to move the conference from Christmas. But actually, some of them do have to do with equality and diversity. If you are a woman in the profession with family and children and in-laws, a conference 1 week before Christmas, you're excluded from. Forget it. That is not happening. As only the third BISA female chair, I care quite deeply about the accessibility of our activities, in particular the conference. So for that and many other reasons, I'm not in favour of moving the conference to the week before Christmas. I also think, but this speaks to a more serious point about how we do the conferences. Universities can now not give us prices that compete with the private sector. Even in not very pleasant student accommodation, private sector hotels, conference facilities offer us a better deal. So there's an economics to that which perhaps higher education leaders like myself need to reflect on. So do I think that the profession is diverse enough? No, we have a long way to go still, I would agree. I do think BISA has done a lot of work on this. It commissioned some work with PSA a few years ago to look at the exit, high levels of exit of black and minority ethnic and women scholars from the profession. We did some really good analysis. We showed that there was a leaky pipe all the way up so that when you get to professor, it's still about 30% of women make it to professor and diminishingly few from ethnic minority backgrounds in the UK. And that reflects the broader social sciences, although we're the worst in the social sciences. Geography do better, sociology does better. So yes, we have a lot of work to do and I'm really pleased that BISA continues to take this seriously. On the final question, I might allow others to have some floor time. Not that I'm dodging it, but I think I'd actually want to think about it more before I gave you a sensible and well thought through answer. But it's an excellent question and one we should all be thinking through. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, they're all great questions, but for reasons of time, I'm just going to sort of tackle one and a half. I think part of the reason why there's also perhaps a relative diminution of people from other, particularly continental European countries, is because there is also the growth of their national associations, which now have national conferences as well, which wasn't the case previously, I think, particularly with the Scandinavians, for example. So there is a more and more crowded calendar, I think, of conferences. And also, of course, conferences has become much more expensive, the undertaking of going relative to the sums of money that people have available to attend those. So I think people have to think quite hard, especially in the UK, where they may not have personal research allowances and that kind of thing, and where they may be self-funding participation in a conference as to where they might choose to go. I wanted to sort of comment on the practitioner participation, if I may. For me, one of the most interesting, I have to say, experiences, in being a graduate student and going to the BISA conference was William Wallace's after-dinner speech, which was then turned into was it Monks and Technocrats article, which people could go away and look at. And I found it was absolutely fantastic because it was a real tussle. And he was a bit cheeky and a bit rude in terms of the people in the audience he was having a go at. But it was very electrifying, I have to say, in terms of having that conversation in that room after dinner. And then, I think it's probably the only after-dinner speech I've ever been to that people chatted about for the rest of the conference. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary, the effect that it had. But I think it also represented what has continued to be a tension within the discipline between those who feel comfortable and relaxed and want to engage with practitioners and those who feel deeply uncomfortable with the idea that you might be enmeshed, your agenda might be determined by, or you might be co-opted in terms of working with or engaging with in all sorts of different ways. And, I worked at Chatham House. I continue to work with think tanks, so you could probably see where I would sit and what I would think about that divide. But one of the striking things, the impacts I think we've had as a discipline, people in this room have had, is that huge numbers of our students actually work as practitioners. What's fascinating when you do encounter them from time to time is, first of all, the impact that teaching had on the way that they think about the world, or their research or their guided research had, but also very often the way that they wrestle with, the difficulties of being a practitioner, where there are certain requirements in terms of doing the job. And we've seen that very, very recently over the British government's position on Gaza. And what they feel comfortable with doing in their day job. So, I think there's been a net benefit from us engaging in that way. Whether there is a benefit from us engaging with practitioners at the sort of official level, if I could put it that way, I think is or stay for half a day. What I really want to do is to us to go to them and have our conference in the Foreign Office and sit there for 5 minutes and then disappear and say, look, I'm really sorry, we can only give you a day or, you know, a few hours because we've actually got more important stuff to do back in our universities. Thank you very much. And I think we might then send a message as to how much time they give us or should give us in comparison to what they do. There are exceptions, of course, and some of them I know are here at the conference.
So just quickly, Laura, it's very nice to see you and thank you for the question. If you look at trustees of all professional associations, they are not what we would want to see in terms of EDI and representation. Having said that, there is a warning here that if one stands up to be a trustee of a charity, then you are legally liable unless you're insured for a lot of things that can go wrong. So it's a big undertaking. And I think we need to look at whether we're doing enough to attract people to taking on that kind of liability and burden. So it's not something you can just do and walk away from, particularly if you're looking at an organisation with financial troubles or infrastructure. So how do we incentivise people, terrible word, to do that? Christmas conference we ran in. The thing is with Christmas, if you put in all those people, and I would add people with caring responsibilities generally, it was very difficult. But it is much cheaper to get a hotel somewhere really freezing like Scotland over Christmas. So you can bring the costs down. But then you have to weigh that against whether you can provide childcare, whether you can do all of those things at a reasonable rate. So there's no ideal time. But I think that when we looked at it, we were very reluctant to give up that Christmas slot because we could get really good deals at that time of year if you would put up with the Swansea in the rain, the Jim Callaghan and the drinking of the whiskey. That was a gift, actually, for the after-dinner speaker, but it disappeared in a memorable BISA moment, I think.
Thank you. Do we need formal training in IR? Not necessarily at the first degree, but at some point I think we do, because I think we should be proud of the body of thought and literature which has gradually developed under the heading of IR, even if we allow ourselves to be quite relaxed about where the boundaries of the subject area are. And it relates back to what I was saying earlier about suspicion, even the degree of contempt towards the beginnings of the subject, which, you know, obviously got going professionally in the sort of 50s and 60s. And I think that that has changed. I think linking it to the question of experts, it's true that when I first started talking to people in the Foreign Office or whatever, they would be rather skeptical. I mean, apart from the fact they're all very busy, they just don't have time to read this stuff, you know, but they would be skeptical. Since I've been in Cambridge the last 20 years, we've been teaching some members of the armed services, about 6 on the master's course every year. People who are bright, going to go on to a good career, often in military intelligence or something. And interestingly enough, the things that most interest them are not the kind of stuff, the facts, of empirical work. They're interested in the theory. They know, we don't get any of this, you know. Oh, these are ideas, you know. We don't have time for ideas normally. I'm not saying they take it all on board, of course, but they're absolutely fascinated by it, you know. Even post-positivism, you wouldn't expect it, but they certainly are. And also, actually, this last couple of weeks, a few people of the Foreign Office have been coming up for just a few days to talk to a number of people around. And, you know, they were interested, 2 of them, one interested in political psychology and the other interested in lessons of history. And I said, well, actually, there's quite a lot of literature on all this. And so it was my job to give a kind of potted summary of some of it. Oh, that's really interesting. I'll take away some of that, you know. So there is stuff, actually useful ideas, books, that they, if they've got time to read them, that they're now quite interested and keen to take on in a way that some American practitioners have been perfectly used to doing with somebody like Graham Allison for many years, of course. Fred Halliday always used to complain that, where are the great books in international relations? We always do, is a sociologist or an economist going to ever read any of our books? Well, I think that was fetishizing great books. We talk about Rawls or Dahl or something, but put them on a pedestal. But there are actually quite a lot of important things written in our area and have been over the last 50 years. You look at, Susan Strange's State and Markets, Casino Capitalism was quite ahead of its time thinking about political economy, even at the very sort of nuts and bolts level of policy. I don't think we've got anything to be embarrassed about. I think we've got a lot to contribute, but at the same time, we've got to be open. Chris here has done political theory. He's done international theory. Political theorists now can't do political theory without thinking of the international dimension of the whole thing. It's not all down to Chris, of course, but it's an important. It's an important development, and we should, I think, build on those things as we are.
Thanks very much. The point Matthias makes about the conference is, I think it's been answered. I like the Christmas conferences, and lots of people came, and including lots of women. I think both women and men regarded this as an opportunity to ditch problems onto their partners, and it wasn't just the men who did this. I think there were lots of factors in changing it, though, I'm sure. And one of them, of course, is related to whether international membership come, because one of the problems with Christmas is the plane fares cost an absolute fortune from the States and from large parts of Europe. The reason there were fewer foreigners originally and there are fewer foreigners now, the competition, EISA, ECPR, workshops, there's so many demands on so little money. British universities have a lot less money for this sort of thing now than even they used to have, and they didn't have a great deal in the old days. So I think there has been a change of that kind. I think there's also been a change in, one of the issues you ask is, are the leading figures of the field coming to the conference and giving papers? And that's a question which needs to be asked regularly. Because if they're not, then people will want to go to the places where they are. Formal training, if I can... Christopher accused me of having formal training in IR, which I'm taking as an accusation rather than... I did the BSc Econ at the LSE, which was not like... It certainly involved international relations, but I think it was less than 40% of the course. The BSc Econ involved 3 years of economics, 3 years of history, extensive studies of law, international and domestic, plus international relations. It wasn't an intensive IR course. It was a general course in the social sciences, and it was abandoned at the LSE before I returned to the motherland. And had I been around at the time, I would have resisted its abandonment. I think the BSc Econ was a better way of approaching IR than a simple IR degree. But that's my problem. I'll pass on.
Okay, a brief remark on the question, is the West liberal? Does the West exist? So I think this question is now only meaningful in the past tense. We can argue about whether it was liberal or not, but it's not there anymore, in my view. But I want to pick up the question again about people's training and backgrounds and such like. When I actually took an undergraduate degree in international relations, which was a joint degree between history and political science at the University of British Columbia, which was quite progressive in that sense. The American dominance of the discipline has meant that vast numbers of people think that there's no difference between international relations and international politics, which reduces the subject simply to being a subset of political science. And I've spent much of my career opposing that view. So I want to morph that into what Chris said in his first intervention, that international relations isn't a discipline. A lot of people think that, but I disagree. It seems to me it's certainly a bit different as a discipline. A lot of the other disciplines in the social science are defined by a certain type of behavior, political behavior or social behavior or economic behavior or legal behavior. History, however, is defined by time. And it seems to me that international relations as a discipline is defined by the fact that it deals with the macro side of everything. And so it deals with the big side of politics and the big side of economics and of law and all of those kind of macro sides of the social sciences and history. And it combines those things in that big picture perspective. And in that sense, it seems to me, it can be understood as a discipline, and that's quite a useful way of looking at it and a useful way of selling it, I think, because the dithering over whether it's a discipline or not sounds as if we don't quite know what we're talking about, and it's not a good way to sell the subject. But if you style it as being about the macro side of things and what that looks like and how all of those different chopped up disciplines interrelate with each other at that higher level, then I think it begins to make more sense.
Thank you all. We are almost out of time, so there's not enough time to take further questions, and there is a reception to go to. So, and I'm not going to try making some sort of Olympian summing up of all of this. So, just some words by way of conclusion. My own experience of BISA, and I hope this is true of all of us, as well as being chair, one is also a trustee and often a vice chair, and then afterwards, the honorary president. So serving BISA actually involves quite a period of time, continuous time. And so one works for some great colleagues, one oversees sometimes very challenging circumstances, a pandemic or bankruptcy or rewriting the ordinances, which is something Juliet and I did. So it is, it's quite a deep experience in many ways. But it is a unique model of organization. It's very different from the way a university is run. And it requires, as I think all of you have referred, a lot of voluntarism by academics. But of course, it is overseen by great permanent staff. And Juliet, the current executive director, is down here at the front, as well as some of her team, without whom none of this would be possible. And I realize that is a cliche. But the fact the organization has survived and thrived is because of people like us, people like you, but also the wonderful staff who have given of their time to work on it all the time, unlike us who go back to teaching and so on and have other duties to perform. So its continuation is not straightforward. It's sometimes a matter of survival, and that is down to the great efforts of all those involved in it. That march towards professionalism has been worth it. You know, it's on a very safe footing. I don't see the innards of the budget anymore, but I'm sure it has a great future. So thank you to all those who come before us, come after us, including some of the chairs, vice chairs, treasurers, secretaries, etc., who are not here today, which have kept the organization running. And I'm going to stop in a second, but I'm going to finish with a rather gnomic quotation, which I think sums up some of this. And this comes from a colleague and friend to a number of us on the panel, and maybe some of the audience, my former head of department, Mike Smith. He was head of department to me, I was head of department to him, and that reciprocity is sometimes beneficial. Anyway, at his inaugural lecture, he finished by saying the following. He said to be a great academic, you need to respect your students, your colleagues, and your subject. Now, the first two, I think, are self-evident. The third, I still haven't quite worked out. But I think BISA is part of that process. To respect your subject means to engage in a great organization like this. And we've heard about its onward challenges and development from our panel today. So respect you all, and I'll finish there. If we could have a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Anything else I need to say at this point? Are there any sort of technical or no? Okay, great.